Hello, fellow splitting geniuses. Welcome to another live episode of Splitting Smart, where Heather and I get to have candid and super informative discussions with divorce and well-being professionals. So our goal is to provide you the knowledge of various modalities of support that can help you to unhitch with fewer hitches. Today's conversation is about educating you on equity compensation. It's a mouthful, such as restricted stock units and other options in a company structure. And this conversation is for the spouse that does not earn the equity compensation. It is also important to note that we'll be giving California specific examples, so viewers should check the laws of their own state. We also suggest that you have a pen and paper handy and take some notes because the information can get a little overwhelming. Anyway, I'm Laurie Itkin Ali, a mom, a divorcee, and a divorce coach, and the founder of Split FYI.
And I'm Heather Steer, a divorcee, a CDFA, a divorce coach, and mother of two girls, and also the co-founder of Split FYI. Before we introduce our next guest, and since we are live, we wanted to mention that if anyone has any questions, put them in the chat box. I'll be monitoring that as we go, and we'll try to get to them before the end of our live. And if we don't, we will actually go and respond to comments afterwards. So even if you're watching this not live, you can put comments on there, and we do follow up with anything that's added in there. So without further ado, our guest today is Laurie Itkin, also known as the Options Lady. She's a certified divorce financial analyst, a financial advisor, and author of an Amazon bestseller book, Every Woman Should Know Her Options, Invest Your Way to Financial Empowerment. She has worked on more than 230 divorce cases in California and specializes in equity compensation, including how to treat RSUs, restricted stock units, we'll learn today, and stock options in divorce. So thank you for joining us today, Laurie.
So happy to be here. Thank you, ladies.
Good to have you. Okay, so I think the first important question is, why should somebody spend time to understand this issue? That's a mouthful for most people.
It's a great question because a lot of people don't even consider this issue in their divorce settlement. And let me just say this. If you had a house that you shared with your spouse, would you just sort of forget about dividing that? Well, equity compensation can be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, in most cases, tens of thousands of dollars. But boy, I mean, Heather and I have seen cases where they're hundreds of thousands of dollars. So although the asset may not be so visible to you like a house, it can be just as valuable, if not more. So you really should learn a little bit about this issue. And that's why we're here today.
Well, and it's so confusing, even for we said that this was for the person that wasn't compensated this way, but a lot of times even the employee who is compensated that way is super confused about it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And where it gets confusing is that some of this type of equity compensation may show up on the spouse's W-2. So that's pretty easy to get. You know, when you file your tax returns, you may see W-2 income, but some of this stuff doesn't show up on the W-2. Some of this stuff shows up in the W-2 in a misleading way, which makes you think there's more money than there really is. So this is a really confusing topic. Not only are the numbers themselves confusing, but the way they're taxed is confusing. And who cares about taxes? Like, we always think about taxes, we dealt with later. Well, if the company is awarding you restricted stock units and taking out 40% of them before you even get them, I think we want to know that if you're expecting $100,000, but you're only getting $60,000, we're going to talk about that today and why that's the case.
Interesting. So what are the common types of equity compensation for public traded companies?
Okay, so in most cases, what I see in my practice is something called restricted stock units, RSUs. So you want to get familiar with that term, RSUs. Sometimes they're called restricted stock awards, which is a slightly different animal. There's performance units. So I'm using RSUs as the most common, but just know that there's tiny little variables on these. And that's like, so if your spouse works for a Qualcomm, Amazon, Google, Facebook, some of the high-tech companies, maybe some of the publicly traded biotech companies, or really even a lot of just rank and file companies now, like a pharmaceutical company may issue RSUs. And how do you know if your spouse works for a publicly traded company? If you know the name of the company and can Google, Acme Corporation stock, and there's a stock symbol and it trades on the stock market, it's a publicly traded company. That's your hint.
Right.
And it used to be that only like the high ranking people got this kind of equity compensation. It is so common now, it really has been for the past 15 or 20 years, that I'll give you an example. I'm working on a lot of cases right now at Amazon where they seem to pay these employees of all different titles $160,000 base salary. Like, I keep doing these cases, I'm like, wow, well, he made 160.
That's like salary cap. They have a salary cap at Amazon.
Oh, well, there we go. They have a salary cap. So, but when I look at the tax returns, some of these gentlemen are making $600,000, $800,000 a year.
Yeah.
Now, how'd you know about the salary cap? I mean, I was wondering.
Well, I got recruited by them a long time ago, and my future brother-in-law worked at Amazon too, and it's still current. I mean, his company got bought by them, and he was like, I had to take a pay cut. I mean,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's a salary cap, and they do a lot of equity compensation there.
So that's a great example where, we're thinking, I'm thinking, how much am I going to get in child support or spousal support? And what's crazy is you may have one spouse with a salary of $200,000, but the other spouse only makes $160,000 at Amazon. Who's going to pay who child support? But then you actually look at all this equity compensation, all the restricted stock units that are granted, and that $160,000 wage earner might actually be earning $500,000 a year. And this is very complicated because that equity compensation isn't paid out every 2 weeks like you get your little check that gets deposited. And so how are you supposed to figure out monthly child support or spousal support when the employee is getting this windfall once, maybe twice, maybe 4 times a year? But it's usually once a year in most cases.
Right. And then do they actually want to execute on those, units and take ownership and sell them for the cash that then correlates to, that income? Because in California, they will say that that's income, even though it's not your compensation.
And we'll get to that, I think, a little later. There's a lot of issues. Is it property divided? Is it income available for support? But anyway, if your spouse works for a publicly traded company, you're going to want to ask, if they're not disclosed on the schedule of assets and debts, RSUs. And then the other common type of compensation that's equity related that you might hear about are stock options. And, stock options are less common in publicly traded companies than they used to, but all these people who work for startups now, right? They're working for these startups, they're getting paid in equity. What does that mean? Often they're getting paid with stock options, which have no value now. There's no way to sell them. There's no marketplace to sell them. It's almost like when I explain a marketplace, when I say a liquid marketplace, if you had a bushel of apples, okay, and you were trying to sell the apples, unless there's a farmer's market, how are you going to, you're going to call everybody on the phone one by one and say, would you like my apples? No, you're going to go to a marketplace where there's buyers and sellers of these apples. Well, in a lot of privately held companies or startups that are not publicly traded, there's no one's going to buy your options. So we're talking about future compensation. And let me tell you, this is the biggest mistake I see people make on their disclosures, whether intentional or not. The employee who gets stock options, because today they look like they're worth nothing, and there's a complicated formula, I'm not going to get into that, but they look like they're nothing. They couldn't get cash now. They'll just leave it off the disclosures. They'll say, these things aren't worth anything. They're zero. How do I give you half of zero? Oh, I'll give you half of everything, but I can't give you half of zero. When do we know? Maybe a few years from now, those things could be worth a lot of money. And then what have you done? Negotiated your settlement. You don't get those. Well, if you didn't negotiate, or worse, because the lawyers will tell you, well, it was an omitted asset. There's some remedies. If you have an omitted asset, maybe I know you can go and ask for legal help. But what if you decided and agreed I'm going to give up my right to those options because they're worth nothing because I want to keep the house.
Right.
Right. Right.
Okay.
So it's almost like some of this compensation is visible today, some of it's invisible, and some of it is awarded in the future. But there is a community, well, I'm going to talk about California here. There is a community property interest in some of this that hasn't vested yet, meaning the employee doesn't currently have the right to sell the stock or exercise these options. The employee doesn't have the right to create cash from it now. But you, as the other spouse, have a share of that. We're in a community property state in California, and you have a share in that. In other states that are equitable distribution states, you still might have a share in this. So again, why do we care? Because this could be worth tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in your net worth.
And does it mean, and this is something that's interesting, because does it mean though that it's still, they're still tied into their ex-spouse until these, and I think this is a conundrum for a lot of people because they just want it done, they want it signed, they don't want any more ties. It's like what you said earlier, it's like having a house and holding on to it and waiting for it to, appreciate in value and then sell it, but you're still tied into with your ex. So how do you work around that, if you can?
That's a great question. So let's use a simple example. I call the RSUs the simple example. It's nothing simple, but that's a straightforward example. So let's say, again, I'll just use Acme Corp. Your husband works at Acme Corp, and his E-Trade account shows that he has 100 vested stock units. He can sell those today. And the E-Trade account may or may not, there may be a separate document, but the E-Trade account may or may not, or it is a separate document, show how many shares of Acme Corporation he'll get next year and the next year and the next year, and when they become sellable. And so you are right, Lila. There will be a certain amount of equity that can be divided today, unless you guys haven't spent it. And there are many people that use that equity compensation to pay bills. It's part of the lifestyle of the marriage, right? Remember the Amazon guy who's getting 160,000 in salary, but you're not living off 160, you're living off of $500,000.
Right.
So what I recommend is a deferred distribution, meaning that as these equity compensation units vest, these restricted stock units vest over time, and you're only going to be tied for this for property division for maybe 1 to 3 years on average, because there's a formula, a time rule formula. And there can be a schedule in your marital settlement agreement. You will know when these things vest. You will know when your spouse has paid tax on it because the company has taken the taxes out, and you will know what you are due. So those are what people hire me all the time to do reports on the stock units that will become vested or available to sell, and how much at that time the other spouse is entitled to it. So for property division, you may only be connected for a few years. Right. The bigger issue that you are thinking about and going to ask me is, well, what about child support and spousal support? Little Johnny's only 3 years old.
Right.
Yep.
Well, I would hope that you would negotiate to have some of this equity compensation be part of what we call a bonus table. So this isn't new to anybody. Anybody with variable income, particularly in California, they may base monthly child and spousal support on the base salary, but then there's bonus income sometimes. And this can be treated similar to bonus, where you've negotiated that anytime husband gets a windfall, a payout, wife gets X percent for child support and Y percent for spousal support.
You see that a lot with sales commissions too. That's another place that pops up.
Right, exactly. Any type of variable income. Real estate agents, why is that any different? You could do that with a real estate agent. Now, this isn't as easy, and I do want to back up and just apologize for presuming it's the man at the company and the wife. I mean, I work with a lot of same-sex couples, so there's going to be two women here, but we were just using that as an example.
Yeah. So now, okay, so we've talked about a variable, different types of work, but what about privately held companies? And because I know you did mention startups,
Right.
what kind of compensation do they give their employees generally, besides stock options that are, yeah.
All right. So lots of times when you join a startup, they go, we're broke, we have no money. Lila, we love you. We think you're so talented. We're going to hire you and you're going to work for equity and you're going to get 1 million. I'm giving you 1 million options.
Right. Exactly.
Sounds good. Like if these things are worth $1, if they're just worth $1, I got $1 million.
Yeah, completely.
That's Lila and I on paper today.
Yeah, except they're worth like not even a cent. But yes, okay.
Right, exactly. So you need to negotiate. Okay, this is why it's so important. If you have this kind of stuff in your marriage, you really need to work with a financially sophisticated mediator and/or attorney. And if you don't have what you feel is somebody who specializes in that, hire someone like me or Heather, who's a CDFA, a certified divorce financial analyst. We will do this work either as a neutral, which means we're not going to be biased to either party. You're going to be mad, you both will be mad at me, or you both love me, right? Or one of you will hire me. And it's typically it's the non-employee spouse who hires me just to check, because as Heather said before, the employee spouse may know every day how much they're worth. They may have their little phone app here, the stock app looking, oh my, this is on a publicly traded company. My company's worth blah, blah, blah. I made $30,000 today just sitting here, I'm drinking my coffee. And so that even the employee spouse isn't going to understand how this stuff works in a divorce. So back to a privately traded company or privately held company, a startup, there may be nothing. How many startups go bust? Tons. There may be not a nothing, or there could be a big payout. So there's got to be a provision that if there is what we call a liquidity event, that either if those options were partially earned during the marriage, then the non-employee spouse owns a partial amount of that equity. And if the employee spouse joined the company after the divorce, but there were provisions for spousal or child support, then that income, if it's $1 million 2 years from now, is fair game, except for the lifestyle of the marriage. So it's very common to see these payouts capped. Okay, let's say you guys lived on $200,000 a year as household income for 15 years, you get a divorce. Now, husband, again, I'm using the husband gets scores for this startup and gets $1 million cashed out to him. I don't know. Now, for child support, typically the child is going to benefit from the income levels of the parents, but spousal support, should the ex benefit? Usually not, but I'm not to say I'm the financial analyst. I'm not the lawyer here, and I'm not a judge.
Right. Well, and everyone negotiates it differently, particularly when you're not in front of a judge, and that's why it is really important to get educated. And I want to touch on something you did say. So yes, I agree. Go find a certified divorce financial analyst, but go one level deeper and find the one that specializes in this. For example, if I get this phone call and to create a report, I'm going to refer to Laurie, and I can review her reports, but from scratch, I'm certainly not going to do it. But I'm smart enough to review a report. So to actually dig into all of the agreements, what can be done, because some of these companies also won't allow these to be split. They have to stay with the employee spouse. So there needs to be some other, creative solution done. And there's a lot of ways to do these, which we're not going to go down that rabbit hole today. But I would say, ask that question to your CDFA also. There's all of us specialize in different things: business valuations, executive compensation, lifestyle analysis. There's all sorts of pieces to this. So
that's a great point, Heather. Like, I would never be able to value business. I have no training in valuing a business. So I actually refer those calls to another CDFA.
Right. That is actually really important to know. It's not always a one-stop shop.
No. Well, just like anything as specialties.
So
Yeah.
let's say my spouse, tells me, and this is something to do with when you are negotiating and when you, to Heather's point, sometimes you can negotiate it before the hand and so forth, and it really depends on the people. But like, what if a spouse says, well, I want you to give up you can keep the house, right? If I can keep my RSUs. And how do you know, like, or vice versa, whatever, how do you know when that's a fair deal?
That's a great question. Great question. So I prepare master spreadsheets. These spreadsheets, what I like to do is model stock prices of the company. So let's go back to a publicly traded company, because that's easier to deal with this.
Right.
Like, take Amazon stock. I mean, just last month, it was a 3,000 a share. Then it was 3,300 a share. I mean, it goes up 5-10%. I mean, this is a big deal, right? So
Right.
in my spreadsheets, I often will say, if the value of the stock is this amount, then this. And I'll change. And if the company withholds this amount for tax, then this is the number. And I can do scenarios. If you divide the property this way, because these spreadsheets, these things vest over time. And so there's different, you can't just say I get 50%. This is what's misleading. I get 50% of the community property. Well, first of all, we have to determine which of these equity compensation units, these RSUs, are community property.
Mhm.
And over time, as they vest, the community property portion decreases. And I have to do this huge spreadsheet with many rows showing that the first batch, the community interest is 50%. Then 8 months from now, it's 33%. And then this tranche is 18%. Then I got to divide it by half, because you're not the community, you're half the community, right? Then I got to take, well, how much did the company withhold in taxes? And if this is a stock option, totally different analysis, because the company doesn't tax it until you've exercised and sold.
Right.
So these are huge. And it's frustrating for everybody, because I remember the first time I looked at one of these spreadsheets that a mentor had done. I'm like,
Yeah.
what?
I mean, you have me like spinning right now. So yeah, it's not my language of choice.
I mean, I'm like, what? I can't even, I mean, is this like a hieroglyphic? What the heck is this? It's like, it was worse. My husband and I went to Budapest on our honeymoon, and we had to ride the Hungarian subway, and the signs were all like 20 letters. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
So not only do you need a CDFA that can do the spreadsheet, like these forensic accountants do the spreadsheet, but explain it in a memo that an 8th grader can understand. And I'm not trying to pretend anyone's an 8th grader, but you've got to use 8th grade language. Otherwise, people are just going to be like,
Exactly.
Yeah.
and they're going to disengage. And then the other issue on this is, how much are you going to spend when we have a privately held company where we can't really value these options? You can't really value them. That goes back to your question about the house. How do I know if it's a good deal? Because I can't value it. Well, that's very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think this is where you can work with a generalist CDFA and say, look, the options are either going to be worth $0, they're going to be worth $1 million, they're going to be worth somewhere in between. My share might be this. Is a house more important today? Is it more valuable? Is a bird in the hand more valuable today to me? Can I take $200,000 now and give up on the chance that it may be worth $1 million later? Would I be happy? I can't answer that for you. All I can do as a good CDFA is lay out all these scenarios and have you use your values to say what's important to you, because you can't go back. I mean, you can't say, I'm going to give up my rights to this to keep the house or to keep the retirement account. And then he strikes gold and you go, shit. Oh, sorry. And on the other hand, if you say, oh no, he wants those options, I know they're going to strike gold. He wants them too bad. He wants them too much. and you just wait for them. And then at 0, you're going to be like, oh,
Right.
It's a gamble. A lot of these really are a gamble. I mean, we don't know where these things are headed. So I have to have those conversations regularly with people of, what do you want to do here? And it's,
But
again,
I think it's part of the reason why people kind of put the white flag up and just give up, and I think that they take the easier option, and the easier option is what's to the eye, not the blind eye. And I think that's where, what you and Heather do is really important, because again, it is that I kick myself later on. What did I do? Why did I do this? Because let's face it, also keeping a house, there's an overhead to it. There's a huge expense and cost to it. And it doesn't mean that it goes up in value. In fact, I've had properties that have devaluated because of global pandemic and political things, that happen. So,
right.
We can't predict those either, right? So to your point, there is a lot about what your value is personally, but also you need to have, like you said, you need to know your options relatively, like here, what can happen. Here are the scenarios.
Right. And don't forget, the employee's spouse may lose their job. And if you lose your job, some of that stuff, just, you never get it. Or maybe you're older and you're retiring, and maybe there's a provision that you do get some or all of them. So, and then we've got to look at the risk of the company. What if the company is doing well or may not do well? I mean, these are all the what ifs. And like I said, you just, first of all, so this is the first step this is just a general overview of options and RSUs, and there's so much other stuff, but just know this is important. It's worth a lot of money potentially, and that you need to get educated, and then you need just somebody who can work with you to lay out the possible scenarios to determine what is the best course for you.
Yeah, a strategic thinking partner is huge because it is complicated. So
it is. I think one of the last things, and I know I wanted to wrap up and see if there's any questions out there for you specifically, and I know we don't have to go in depth totally, but tax implications. You mentioned it before. It's a huge component. I think people don't think about that necessarily, especially if you're not the person who's been filing your taxes. So could you just give a little overview on that?
Sure. Basically, when in a publicly traded company, when the RSUs vest, the company most likely withholds a percentage. Typically, that is around 40%. It can be a little lower, sometimes slightly higher. And the problem is that is not how much tax you owe on those, because it's an estimate, it's a withholding. So you know what? You may actually sell those shares, spend the money, or give them to your spouse, or give half to the spouse, and you realize that a year later when you file your taxes, I owe more tax to the state and federal government. We owe $25,000, but we're no longer married. Now I got to go back to my ex and tell her that she owes me money for the taxes. Not good, not good. Or the other way, too much money was withheld for taxes. So I, as the non-employee spouse, didn't get my share. And then when it comes to child and spousal support, you've got to remember these things are taxed, but these calculations are based sometimes on the gross value. So when property is divided, it's based on the net value after taxes are considered. But when the child and spousal support percentages are applied, they're usually based on the gross value before taxes are taken out. So all I can say is that don't think taxes are some small little thing to the side. Taxes are a huge component in any evaluation of these.
Very important to note.
Yes, tax implications across all assets are always important to consider. I mean, down the list. So that's great advice. And again, if you come across these scenarios, particularly in California, Laurie works across the state, the options lady. We'll put her details in our comments and how you can contact her. She's wonderful to work with, and we're super appreciative of your time. This was really, like, you are very, very good at explaining it in layman's terms, which I super appreciate. And it's because it's so complicated. Like the formulas, when I had to study it, I was like, whoa. Which is why I didn't make it my expertise.
Yeah, even looking at a spreadsheet is so overwhelming, and people going through a divorce are already super overwhelmed. So it's good for them to know that there's someone like you who can help decipher that
Happy to
and
do it.
translate, for them.
It is a translation. It's a translation, and I love doing it. And the more I do it, is the faster I become, so the less expensive it is. Oh, and I should just let people know, in general, these types of analyses usually take between 4 and 10 hours, depending on how complicated, how long you've been at the company. So you might have many tranches of things. But typically, that's what you should budget for one of these analyses. And if you can get your spouse to share in the cost, even better, because I do it once.
Yep.
Right.
100%.
And if you have differences of opinion over the date of separation, which impacts this, I forgot to add that, the date of separation impacts the value enormously. I can run the analysis using 2 different dates of separation, so that I did one the other day where if it was one date of separation, the non-employee spouse would receive $110,000 more than if it was the other date of separation.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's a huge discrepancy.
Yeah, that's a big But it could take the issue off the table with the date of separation by being like, oh, it's a small difference.
Correct.
I think
Exactly.
typically date of separation around these is one of the reasons, though, that people have a difference of opinion. So
That's right. Yeah. Well, if I can be available as a resource, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, theoptionslady.com.
Yes, fantastic.
Thank
Thank you,
Laurie.
Laurie.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here with your community. You guys are great. Thank you.
You.
Thank you.